Do you take the Bible literally? I had asked that question myself on numerous occasions, and I was quick to write off anyone who said no. I was sure that they were infected with the disease of theological liberalism. Therefore, any argument they could make was quickly dismissed. It was evident, or so I thought, that they simply didn't believe the Bible was true. And herein lies the problem. Dispensationalists have been trained to use the words literal and true synonymously. Hello, I'm Jerry Johnson, and I welcome you to this edition of Against the World. This episode of Against the World is brought to you by our dear friends, the Fomichenkos, Aleksey, Oksana, Philip, Nikita, and Masha. Thanks, guys, and God bless. And by Grace Reformed Presbyterian Church of Dublin, Virginia. If you find yourself in Southwest Virginia on the Lord's Day, Sunday school is at 10 a.m. and worship at 11. Grace Presbyterian meets in the Dublin Room at the Comfort Inn off of Interstate 81, exit 98. For more information, send an email to gracereformedpc@gmail.com. If you would like to sponsor a segment of Against the World, please send an email to admin@nicengecouncil.com. Thank you and God bless. The problem with this question is no one seems to know for sure what is meant by the word literal. Dispensational scholar Dr. Charles Ryrie attempts to give literal a theological definition as it would apply to the Word of God. Regrettably, he ends up having a word with an ambiguous definition at best. He explains literalism as that which the interpreter should give, quote, to every word the same meaning it would have in normal usage, whether employed in writing, speaking, or thinking, unquote. Of course, the problem with this definition is evident. Now we need to understand what he means by normal usage. And by the way, who gets to define what is normal? Jews? Gentiles? Liberals? Conservatives? First century Romans? Or 21st century Americans? I submit that dispensationalism ultimately goes outside of the Scriptures in order to interpret the Scriptures. They reject the notion that Christ and His apostles have preeminence in interpreting the Old Testament, what I call the Christo-apostolic hermeneutic, and concoct a method in which man is the ultimate judge of the meaning of the text. This same conclusion was reached by former dispensationalist and graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary, Dr. Curtis Crenshaw, in his book, Dispensationalism Today, Yesterday, and Tomorrow. Quote, such statements, as the one by Ryrie, further indicate that the dispensational hermeneutic is derived from a humanistic concept of literal. By assuming the sovereignty of man and the neutrality of philosophy and facts, Ryrie has straitjacketed the Scriptures with his humanistic notion of literal. A few years back, a dear friend of mine who was still infected with the Ryrie-Scofield dispensationalism wanted to come over to my house and discuss the dispensational view of interpretation. So I made a pot of coffee and broke out some of my best cigars. As the conversation wound down and he prepared to depart, I challenged him to study the Church-Israel issue by reading the New Testament definitions into the Old Testament words, and then to answer the following questions. According to Christ and His apostles, who is natural Israel? According to Christ and His apostles, is natural Israel true Israel? And according to Christ and His apostles, who is true Israel? Hey, maybe our dear brother John MacArthur should write a new book, The Church and Israel According to Christ and His Apostles. At any rate, I threw in a few more questions and sent him on his merry little way. Days later, I got a call from this brother, and he said, "Jerry, I never realized what Christ and his apostles meant. I read their words, but I ignored the way they defined them, and I interjected my own definitions that I had learned at Dallas Theological Seminary. I now know why one of my professors warned the class not to read the New Testament back into the Old. If you do, if you give Christ preeminence and his apostles preeminence in interpreting the Old Testament, you will no longer be a dispensationalist." Well, my friends, I rest my case. Until next week, this is Jerry Johnson, standing contra mundum against the world.